Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Tonight, we tumble headfirst into a bottle. But not just any bottle. No. This one glows faintly green under candlelight, smells like a medicine cabinet in mid-rebellion, and has been accused of everything from inspiring artistic revolutions to starting domestic disasters. This is the story of Absinthe, the so-called green fairy. A drink so controversial, so poetic, and so completely misunderstood, it made wine look like communion juice. So fluff your pillow, loosen your corset, metaphorically or not, and join me as we rewind to a moment in time when medicine was mostly guesswork and alcohol was still being passed off as a vitamin supplement. Let's begin. In the late 18th century, deep in the Swiss valleys where people had more herbs than sense, a French doctor named Pierre Ordinaire. Yes, that was really his name, and yes, it does sound like a middle school insult. Concocted a bitter green tincture made of wormwood, anise, fennel, and whatever else was hanging around the apothecary shelves. Supposedly, he created it as a universal cure-all. Because, of course, nothing says, "Trust me, I'm a medical professional," like brewing moonshine out of garden weeds and selling it as a miracle tonic. To be fair, wormwood had been around for centuries, praised in ancient medicine for treating everything from indigestion to intestinal worms. And when you consider what people were actually eating in the 1700s, wormwood might have been the least horrifying thing in their bodies. But Dr. Ordinaire, who definitely took his job as wandering physician, a little too literally, turned this herbal oddity into a consumable culture bomb. And like any good scandal, it started off disguised as virtue. He marketed it as medicinal, digestive, antiseptic, a gentle restorative for ladies with vapors and gentlemen with gout. But let's not kid ourselves. This was barely regulated alcohol with a fancy Latin name and a doctor's note. By the early 1800s, Ordinaire's elixir had been commercialized by the Henry Odd sisters, shrewd businesswomen who sold it as a patent medicine, and then, eventually, by Major Dubied and his son-in-law Henri Louis Pernod. And yes, that Pernod, as in Pernod Ricard, the modern drinks empire. Pernod began large-scale distillation in Pontarlier, France, launching a legacy that would define the next 100 years of European drinking culture and scandal. But let's slow down here and address a little context. Why did absinthe catch fire the way it did? What made this forest green liquid rocket from obscure herbal tonic to bohemian nectar and, eventually, moral panic poster child? Simple timing, desperation, and marketing. Europe, particularly France, was crawling out of post-revolutionary trauma and into industrial uncertainty. Urban populations were swelling, disease was rampant, and the average citizen couldn't afford real medical care, let alone understand it. Enter absinthe, bottled hope with a bittersweet aftertaste. It was cheap, it was strong, and more importantly, it was legal. At a time when wine prices were unstable and clean water was a myth told to children, absinthe became a working-class substitute for both hydration and happiness. By the mid-1800s, French soldiers stationed in Algeria were issued daily rations of absinthe to purify their drinking water. A delightful way of saying, we have no idea what's in this river, but alcohol kills stuff, right? Soldiers brought the taste home, and soon the military's green-toned affection trickled into civilian bars and cafés across France. And that's when things got poetic. Because unlike wine, which was steeped in centuries of tradition and class-based snobbery, absinthe felt modern, rebellious, and oddly democratic. It blurred the lines between medicine and vice. It was bitter but elegant, strong but ritualistic, and it came with its own set of mysterious accessories, slotted spoons, ornate glasses, sugar cubes, and a foggy green transformation called the louche. Drinking absinthe wasn't just about getting drunk. It was a performance, a ceremony drenched in allure. Now, if this sounds like a 19th century goop product with 10 times the alcohol and 100 times the drama, you're not far off. But here's where we start to notice the cracks. The first real problem with absinthe wasn't its ingredients. It wasn't the wormwood. It wasn't the anise or the fennel. The real issue was its reputation. A reputation built by marketing illusion, pseudoscience, and one hell of a timing problem. Because just as absinthe was climbing into every café, every artist's studio, and every battered poetry journal across Paris, so too was Europe grappling with the birth of mass media, sensational journalism, and a growing middle-class morality complex. The same newspapers that printed adverts for miracle elixirs and lead-lace lipstick were now turning around and screaming that absinthe was destroying the very soul of Europe. And to be honest, they weren't entirely wrong. The absinthe being consumed in cheap cafés wasn't always Pernod quality. Many producers began cutting corners, using copper sulfate to fake the green colour, or adding toxic cheap alcohols to stretch the bottle. In other words, it wasn't the wormwood that was hurting people, it was capitalism. But nuance rarely sells headlines. So instead of blaming unsafe production, media outlets blamed the drink itself. By the time the 1860s rolled around, absinthe had gone from miracle tonic to scapegoat. Artists who made poor life choices? Blame absinthe. Writers with broken marriages and unpaid rent? Must have been the green fairy. Political unrest? Public brawls? Spontaneous nudity in the town square? Clearly absinthe. Definitely not the crushing social inequality or untreated mental illness. Nope. Just the herbs. So here we are, at the end of this first chapter in our slow descent through the murky glass of history. A drink that began as a bitter little medicinal tonic brewed by a man named Ordinaire. Seriously, you can't make this stuff up. Was now both celebrated and condemned across an entire continent. It was a symbol of art, rebellion, escape, and moral failure all in one. But remember, absinthe hadn't even reached its peak yet. The real chaos. The green hour madness, the café debauchery, the legislative backlashes and banned bottles. That's still to come. So sip slowly, dear insomniac, because we've only just uncorked the bottle. You could tell the time of day in Paris by the colour of the liquor swirling in café glasses. Morning was for coffee, midday for wine. But as the clock crept past 4 and the shadows stretched long across cobbled boulevards, a curious green hue began to shimmer beneath the sun-faded awnings. It was absinthe hour, l'heure verte. And to be honest, it wasn't so much a time of day as it was a state of mind. It started slowly. A flicker of glass, a sliver of sunlight catching the edges of an ornate spoon, balanced delicately atop a fluted glass. A sugar cube, trembling as water trickled from a little brass fountain. Then came the transformation, the loche. That moment when clear emerald turned cloudy, like a fog creeping over a haunted lake. For some, it was chemistry. For others, it was magic. And for most, it was just an excuse to sit a little longer and feel something faintly poetic before the night took over. But there's something worth noting here. Absinthe wasn't just a drink. It was a ritual, a full-body sensory experience that transformed getting tipsy into an art form. Wine was for the refined. Beer was for the working man. But absinthe, that was for the thinkers, the artists, the beautifully unstable souls who needed their glass to reflect their psyche, complex, layered, and occasionally on fire. By the mid-19th century, Parisian cafés had become theatres for this ritual. It wasn't uncommon to see tables covered in half-written poetry, cigarette ash, ink-stained fingers, and wide-eyed declarations about the nature of reality. A single glass of absinthe might last hours, not because of moderation, but because of performance. The pour, the drip, the cloud, the sip, over and over, like a spell cast in public. The effect was subtle at first, not a dizzying rush, but a gentle unravelling. Thoughts stretched, ideas bloomed, or at least that's what they claimed. Whether the poetry improved is still up for debate. It was also a drink of contradictions. Absinthe was bitter but elegant. It numbed the tongue, yet sharpened the imagination. It was legal, accessible, even respectable, until it wasn't. You see, the problem with giving artists a ritual is that they tend to amplify it, especially when there's alcohol involved. Soon, absinthe wasn't just the background hum of Parisian nightlife. It was its heartbeat. And depending on who you asked, that heartbeat was erratic. Writers like Charles Baudelaire, Arthur Rimbaud, and Paul Verlaine didn't just drink absinthe. They baptized themselves in it. For them, it wasn't simply a beverage, but a vehicle to other realms. A green key to unlock forbidden doors inside the mind. And, as you might expect from Victorian-era poets, many of those doors led to existential dread, romantic disaster, and spectacularly unpaid rent. Verlaine once claimed that absinthe made him feel as though his soul was evaporating from his fingertips. A beautiful thought, though it's possible he was just having a panic attack and didn't know the vocabulary. Still, absinthe offered something seductive, a marriage of science and mystery, intoxication and insight. It promised access to genius, and in a society that worshipped both madness and art, it was an irresistible combination. The drink's reputation spread like spilled ink. Artists weren't just drinking it, they were painting it. Posters of green fairies, seductive and spectral, lined the streets. Advertisements winked from the pages of avant-garde journals, promising elevation, transcendence, maybe even immortality. Or at the very least, something strong enough to make you forget your landlord's last warning. And yet, behind all the glamour, there lingered a bitter truth. Not all absinthe was created equal. The finest brands, Pernod Fils and its ilk, were carefully distilled, herbal, balanced. But as demand soared, so did the number of shady distillers who cared less about balance and more about profit margins. They added copper salts for colour, antimony chloride for clarity, and methanol for, well, death. It wasn't unusual for cheap absinthe to leave drinkers not just drunk, but permanently altered. Or worse. This is the turning point where artistic reputation met working-class disaster. Because while the poets suffered dramatically and wrote about it, the labourers, the ones buying basement-tier absinthe in tenement bars, just suffered. The government began to notice. Doctors split into factions. The press had a field day. 1 week, absinthe cured anxiety. The next, it caused it. One article praised its uplifting effects on the spirit. Another warned it would make you hallucinate goblins and beat your children. Spoiler, most of those goblins turned out to be lies sold by the wine industry. Yes, let's not forget the biggest critic in the room, big wine. France's vineyards were struggling through the phylloxera crisis, a vine-killing pest that decimated wine production in the late 1800s. Absinthe filled the gap, became the national drink of choice, and made certain wine producers very, very nervous. So they did what all fragile monopolies do. They funded moral outrage. Suddenly, absinthe wasn't just a threat to the liver. It was a threat to society. Priests warned congregations, mothers warned daughters, politicians warned anyone who would listen. The green fairy became a she-devil, a corrupting force, a criminal co-conspirator, the drink of anarchists, adulterers, and dangerously opinionated painters. And the louder the warnings, the more the public reached for the glass. Because, of course, nothing increases a drink's popularity quite like telling the French they can't have it. So, as this chapter draws to a close, let us marvel at the rise of absinthe. From medicine to madness, from healing tonic to bohemian symbol, from cheap cure to expensive scapegoat. It had not yet been banned, but the storm was gathering. The cafe tables still glowed with green light, the spoons still balanced over sugar cubes, the poets still whispered to invisible muses. But the whispers were about to become screams. Next, we'll step fully into the age of absinthe hysteria, where hallucinations, murders, and moral panic make headlines, and one particularly brutal crime tips the scales forever. So don't wander off just yet. Our glass is only half empty. Chapter 2: Bohemians, Brushes and Benders. By the 1870s, absinthe was no longer just a drink. It had become something else entirely, a badge of identity, a passport into the strange, flickering world of Parisian bohemia. To sip it publicly, especially during the late afternoon haze of the green hour, was to declare something rather bold, that you were part of a different breed. Not just a drinker, but a dreamer. Not just tired of life's rules, but determined to rewrite them while swirling a slotted spoon in cloudy liquid. The cafés of Montmartre and Montparnasse became temples of this belief. Dimly lit, slightly smoke-stained, and always echoing with the rustle of newspaper, laughter, or furious scribbling on cheap parchment, these spaces transformed into arenas where every tortured soul came to drink and perform their own collapse. But collapse stylishly, of course. It was the Parisian way. Painters lounged with stained cuffs and half-finished canvases. Poets mumbled lines of unfinished verse into glasses that trembled ever so slightly from the drip of cold water. Sculptors and singers, revolutionaries and self-diagnosed philosophers, all soaked in absinthe and arrogance, shared tables with lovers, strangers, and the occasional pet monkey in a waistcoat. It wasn't uncommon. After all, this was the same era where artists bartered their last meal for a brush and called it romance. It's important to understand that in bohemian circles, absinthe was never just about intoxication. That would be too simple, too vulgar. No, absinthe was about transformation, a way to transcend the grimy material world of unpaid rent, decaying wallpaper, and persistent coughs that probably weren't just from the weather. It was liquid rebellion, packaged in elegance, and always served with just a hint of poetic despair. Take, for example, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, the diminutive, alcohol-fueled genius behind the Moulin Rouge posters you've probably seen on tourist mugs. Lautrec didn't just drink absinthe. He practically marinated in it. He even carried a custom hollow cane, filled with his chosen green elixir, ready to unscrew at a moment's notice. Now that's what we call dedication, or possibly a cry for help. Either way, he became a staple of the absinthe world, equal parts inspiration and warning. And he wasn't alone. Vincent van Gogh, that poster child for tragic genius, drank absinthe with the desperation of a man trying to outrun his own mind. It's often whispered that his hallucinations and emotional unravelling were fueled by wormwood. While that's scientifically suspect, and more likely due to epilepsy, lead poisoning, and relentless poverty, the myth persists. Because there's something deliciously seductive about blaming a drink for an ear-shaped tragedy. It's neater than admitting the system failed him. Across the street, another café hosted the poet Paul Verlaine, usually drunk, occasionally violent, and often reciting lines he couldn't quite remember writing. His partner in disaster, Arthur Rimbaud, was young, brilliant, and carried the sort of smirk that suggested both divine inspiration and petty arson. Together, they made absinthe look like a love story wrapped in bar brawls and existential crisis. And the public? Oh, the public watched with rapture. Because the 19th century had begun developing a taste for celebrity implosion, well before reality TV made it fashionable. The idea that genius and madness went hand in hand wasn't just tolerated, it was romanticised. The more dishevelled the coat, the more revered the artist. The worse the decision-making, the more authentic the art. It was a time when suffering was mistaken for depth and intoxication for vision. But behind this glamorous grime, there was an uglier truth. No one wanted to sketch into the background. Many of these bohemian lives ended poorly, penniless, institutionalized, or simply forgotten. The myth of the tortured artist sold more books than the reality of the starving one. And absinthe. Well, it may have helped unlock a door or two, but more often it left its drinkers staring into hallways with no exit. Still, the drink's popularity soared. Cafés were redesigning their interiors to accommodate the ritual. Absinthe fountains, ornate glass vessels with spigots designed for the slow drip, became centerpieces on bar tops. Bartenders became performers, delicately managing the dance of water and sugar to awaken the louche. Even the tools of the ritual, the slotted spoons, the branded glasses, became objects of obsession. Some were mass-produced, others handcrafted. All were collectible. A strange blend of art and advertising, of commerce wrapped in intoxicated nostalgia. You could argue that Absinthe's bohemian boom wasn't entirely organic. It was, at least in part, curated performance. Painters who never drank began adding absinthe bottles into their still lifes. Writers whose favourite poison was brandy began referencing the green fairy in their prose. The drink became shorthand for tortured genius, whether or not the drinker had ever picked up a brush or rhymed a single line. Critics, of course, noticed. Some saw it as cultural decay, others as artistic marketing. But the truth, as always, lives somewhere in the muddled middle. Yes, some masterpieces were conceived under the influence of absinthe, but so were countless sloppy sketches, half-finished plays, and unreadable poems about lilies and betrayal. The drink didn't create talent. It just turned the volume up, for better or worse. Yet for every poster of a green fairy fluttering seductively across a cafe wall, there was someone sleeping in an alley, clutching an empty glass and a fading dream. The myth of absinthe was beautiful, but its reality, like the louche itself, was cloudy. And that's the paradox at the heart of this era. Absinthe gave voice to a generation desperate to be heard. It dulled pain, sparked imagination, and allowed for rebellion in a glass. But it also blurred lines between art and addiction, between vision and delusion, between the stage and the gutter. In trying to drink their way into immortality, many forgot that not all rituals lead to revelation. Some just lead to ruin, especially when you start believing your own myth. So next time you see an absinthe spoon in a museum, or a moody green-tinted painting, remember this: you're not just looking at art. You're looking at a culture that tried to distill genius, tragedy, and rebellion into 120 proof poetry. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. But no one could say it wasn't dramatic. If absinthe had a golden age, it was the final decades of the 19th century, an era when the cafés of Paris glowed green not just with liquor but with legend. From Montmartre to Marseille, from sun-drenched boulevards to back-alley bars, the drink was everywhere. In the hands of artists and accountants, poets and pensioners. It had escaped its bohemian birthplace and flooded the mainstream. It was no longer just a ritual of rebellion. It was routine. By the 1890s, absinthe was no longer the drink of the fringe. It was served in train stations, advertised in newspapers, and poured freely in middle-class parlours. Even the upper crust, the aristocrats who once scoffed at wormwood and the street urchins who drank it, now found themselves curiously aligned across cafe tables. The green fairy had blurred the lines between classes as easily as it clouded water. And yet, for all its elegance and ubiquity, something was shifting beneath the surface. Whispers turned to murmurs. Murmurs into warnings. Medical journals began to fill with vaguely sourced case studies, alleging that habitual absinthe drinkers were not just intoxicated, they were ill. Nervous disorders, visual hallucinations, violent outbursts, all of it, we were told, traced back to the green demon. Of course, the fact that many of these drinkers were also deeply impoverished, chronically malnourished, and drinking bootleg absinthe, cut with industrial-grade solvents, that part didn't always make the footnotes. The media, never one to pass up a panic, pounced. Newspapers across France and Switzerland began publishing cautionary tales, peppered with just enough drama to ensure repeat readership. One week, a man murdered his family under the influence. Another, a woman threw herself from a rooftop, screaming about serpents in her glass. Whether these stories were real, embellished, or outright fiction mattered less than the fact that they sold papers. And the phrase absinthe-induced madness began appearing more frequently than anyone liked to admit. The science, meanwhile, remained murky. Some physicians blamed thujone, a compound found in wormwood, for causing seizures and psychosis. Others pointed out that the amounts present in absinthe were too low to be dangerous, unless you were already drinking yourself into oblivion. But in a time when scientific authority often came dressed in mutton chops and wild speculation, clarity was in short supply. Still, the narrative stuck. Absinthe was no longer chic. It was a menace, a corrupter, a slow poison delivered in crystal stemware. The irony, of course, was that most alcohol consumed at the time was far more dangerous. Whiskey, gin, and cheap wine, particularly those brewed without regulation, often contained lead, turpentine, or wood alcohol. But absinthe had something those others didn't: an image, a myth, a signature colour. It was memorable, easy to recognise, easy to blame. And if you were part of the French wine industry, that made absinthe a perfect target. You see, absinthe's rise coincided almost perfectly with the devastation of French vineyards by phylloxera, a root-destroying pest that nearly wiped out the country's wine supply in the mid-1800s. As grape shortages sent wine prices soaring, absinthe, cheap to make, shelf-stable, and potent, filled the void. By the 1880s, absinthe consumption in France rivaled that of wine, and that, to put it mildly, did not sit well with the vintners. So they launched a campaign. Doctors were paid to publish anti-absinthe tracts. Newspapers received generous sponsorships to run stories on the drink's dangers. Posters popped up showing green-skinned demons whispering into the ears of trembling men. Priests preached fiery sermons about the moral rot brought on by absinthe. Mothers were warned. A child raised in a home with absinthe would grow up crooked, sickly, and, perhaps worst of all, disinterested in Sunday school. All the while, the drink itself remained largely unchanged. The best producers, like Pernod Phil's, maintained strict standards. Their absinthe was strong, yes, but not poisonous. But on the cheaper end of the spectrum, things looked different. Distillers, eager to stretch profits, adulterated their product with harmful dyes and additives, copper salts for colour, antimony compounds for clarity, methanol for, well, it's hard to say what they were thinking with that one. Let's just call it optimistic chemistry. For the everyday drinker, these knockoffs became more common, and the symptoms they produced, nausea, dizziness, long-term damage, began to reinforce the very myths the wine lobby had paid to create. The tragedy here wasn't just medical, it was cultural, because in the push to demonize absinthe, the conversation around alcohol regulation, social support, and medical care was pushed aside. Instead of asking why so many were drinking to numb their lives, reformers asked only what was in the bottle. The drink became a scapegoat for deeper failures: poverty, alienation, untreated trauma. It was easier to ban a liquid than to fix a broken society. Still, for now, absinthe flowed freely. In fact, it reached its height of popularity around 1900, featured at the Exposition Universelle in Paris, where entire halls were devoted to absinthe tasting. Tourists, diplomats, and bored aristocrats lined up for their first glimpse of the green fairy. They posed for photos with glasses in hand, smiled in the glow of gaslight, and imagined themselves bohemians, if only for a moment. Meanwhile, in the cafés of Montmartre, the artists who had once championed absinthe began to look a little older, a little thinner, a little more worn around the edges. Some had switched to wine, others to opium. A few had given up entirely, retreating from the glow of the fairy that had once promised inspiration and delivered mostly regret. And in government offices, pens scratched slowly across paper. The first bans were being drafted, quietly, cautiously, not yet enforced, but whispered about. The tide had turned. The drink that once symbolized Parisian glamour was now public enemy number one. But not yet. Not quite. For now, the fountains still dripped. The spoons still glittered. The green light still flickered in the hearts of those who believed, or desperately hoped, that art, escape, and a little carefully measured poison could still change the world. The curtain was beginning to close, but the performance wasn't over. Not yet. Chapter 3. The Panic and the Purge. It's 1905 in the sleepy Swiss village of Comungny, a town known more for its postcard hillsides than for history-making crimes. The morning is quiet, still, and tinged with the sort of mist that makes everything feel slightly theatrical. Inside a modest farmhouse, a man named Jean Lanfray, a French labourer and wine drinker of no small talent, begins his day like many others, with a drink. And then another. And then several more. Lanfray wasn't just any drinker. He was what the medical journals of the time might politely describe as chronically hydrated. By the end of that August morning, he'd consumed copious quantities of brandy, creme de menthe, cognac, and at least 2 glasses of absinthe. Somewhere in the middle of this liquid ballet, he picked up a rifle and shot his wife and 2 daughters. It was a brutal, senseless tragedy, the kind that should have ignited debates about domestic violence, mental illness, and alcoholism. Instead, it ignited something much easier to handle, a crusade against absinthe. You see, out of the several litres of alcohol consumed by Lanfray that day, only the absinthe was mentioned in headlines. Absinthe murder, declared Swiss papers with the kind of glee usually reserved for war victories or royal weddings. The wine and brandy? Mere background noise. In the court of public opinion, the Green Fairy had pulled the trigger. What followed was swift and, in hindsight, tragically familiar. Newspapers ran with the story like wolves at a banquet. Temperance groups held marches. Doctors issued stern warnings. Politicians who had never tasted absinthe suddenly discovered they were passionately against it. By October of that same year, over 80 Swiss citizens signed a petition demanding its ban. By 1908, absinthe was outlawed in Switzerland. This, unfortunately, became the playbook. All across Europe, moral panic began to bloom like algae in a forgotten fountain. One country after another looked at the Swiss example and thought, well, if banning this green poison makes us look righteous, let's do it too. Never mind the scientific evidence, or lack thereof. Never mind that the symptoms of absinthism were often indistinguishable from alcohol poisoning caused by lower quality spirits. The narrative had already taken root. Absinthe wasn't just a drink, it was a social disease. In France, the panic built slowly but with purpose. The cultural heartland of absinthe, the very country that had once celebrated it as a national drink, now turned on it like a betrayed lover. Articles painted images of crumbling families, absinthe-crazed artists, and women, yes, women, drinking alone in public, which was considered by many to be a sure sign of moral collapse. The Green Fairy had done more than challenge the liver, she'd challenged decorum. Religious leaders gave sermons denouncing the drink as demonic. Public health boards commissioned studies so flawed they'd be laughed out of a freshman science class. One experiment involved feeding absinthe to guinea pigs until they died, then declaring the drink dangerous, as though force-feeding anything alcoholic to a rodent wouldn't end tragedy. But reason was no match for spectacle. In 1910, the French National Assembly held a fierce debate over absinthe, one dripping with dramatic irony. On one side were the reformers, waving crime reports and medical pamphlets like swords. On the other were the distillers and their defenders who argued that the problem wasn't absinthe itself, but the counterfeit versions flooding the market. That if people were going blind or losing their minds, it wasn't from the Pernod on the shelf, but from the knockoff mixed in a basement with a prayer and some paint thinner. And they had a point. Absinthe, when made properly, was no more harmful than any other strong spirit. The feared chemical thujone, blamed for hallucinations, madness, and artistic tendencies, was present in such small quantities in quality absinthe that you'd get alcohol poisoning long before you reached a hallucinogenic state. But facts, as history often teaches us, are fragile things when wrapped in moral fear. The turning point came in 1914, when France, already teetering toward war, decided to ban absinthe altogether. The logic was draped in patriotism. How could France expect to win a war if her soldiers were sipping herbal cocktails instead of focusing on duty? Forget that most of them were also issued wine. That was different, they said. Wine was French. Absinthe was foreign, decadent, dangerous. And so, by March 1915, the Green Fairy was officially banished from French soil. It was a quiet execution. No riots, no flames, just the slow disappearance of a ritual. Fountains removed from countertops, spoons tucked into drawers, posters painted over, and in their place, silence, or at least the boring kind of drinking that didn't come with a legend. The ban spread quickly. Belgium outlawed absinthe. The Netherlands followed. The United States, not to be outdone in any moral crusade, banned it in 1912, 2 years before Prohibition even began. Italy, Germany, Austria. Each joined the chorus, with varying levels of enthusiasm and enforcement. It's worth noting that the bans didn't just hurt distillers. They also erased a culture, an entire aesthetic, built on ritual, rebellion, and artistic myth, was swept away by public relations campaigns and questionable science. The poets were gone. The posters taken down. The cafés repurposed. 1,000 little moments of green-lit wonder gone like smoke in a windy room. And in their place? Wine, beer, whiskey, the acceptable spirits. The drinks that didn't come with spoons or stories or sugar cubes, balanced precariously in flickering gaslight. The world hadn't become more sober. It had just become more manageable. But here's the thing. Absinthe never really disappeared. It retreated, hid, went underground, became whispered about in bar corners and remembered in nostalgic tones by old painters and jaded poets. Because legends, real ones, don't die from bans. They ferment, they wait. And as we'll see in the chapters ahead, the Green Fairy wasn't done dancing. Not yet. The Green Fairy may have been banished from the boulevards of Paris, but she didn't vanish. Legends don't go quietly. They smuggle themselves out in suitcases, hide in cellars, and wait. And absinthe, that herb-soaked, scandal-drenched liquid, was never just a drink. It was an identity, an idea. And ideas are notoriously hard to outlaw. As bans rippled through Europe like a puritanical plague, the absinthe culture didn't collapse. It adapted. It slipped through cracks in the law. It wore disguises. It became code. Some distillers simply changed the label, marketing their products as anisette or wormwood aperitifs, quietly omitting the forbidden name. Others went underground entirely, producing bottles by lamplight in dusty workshops, filling them with secret recipes and quiet defiance. In Paris, rumours swirled about hidden speakeasies where absinthe still flowed, served behind false walls or under the counter, to those who knew the right phrase or tipped the right bartender. Absinthe spoons became contraband collectibles, carefully wrapped in cloth and passed between friends like contraband relics of a more poetic age. And then, as if on cue, the story took a steamy detour to New Orleans. Ah, New Orleans. If there was ever a city built for absinthe, this was it. Sultry, strange, and stubbornly resistant to moral regulation, New Orleans was where rules went to sweat themselves out on the porch. It already had its own traditions of herbal liquors, Catholic mysticism, and jazz-soaked rebellion. Absinthe didn't feel foreign here. It felt like home. By the early 1900s, as Europe was pushing the Green Fairy into oblivion, New Orleans welcomed her with open arms and a slow southern grin. In the heart of the French Quarter, at a bar called the Old Absinthe House, The ritual was reborn. Tourists and locals alike gathered to watch the slow drip of water over sugar, the lazy swirl of emerald to cloud, and the steady unravelling of conversation. Politics, poetry, gambling, and jazz, all of it danced in the fog of absinthe. Writers came too, always the writers. American literary rebels like Ernest Hemingway would later romanticize the drink, calling it a brain-warming, idea-changing liquid alchemy. Never mind that Hemingway's idea of moderation was famously non-existent. What mattered was that absinthe regained its allure. It was outlawed in parts of Europe, but in the dim, hazy bars of Louisiana, it was alive and whispering. Even as the US formally banned absinthe in 1912, enforcement was spotty, especially in places where culture had always outweighed legality. And when Prohibition hit in 1920, the line between banned and tolerated blurred further. People were already smuggling whiskey, gin, and bathtub vodka. What was one more ghost in a bottle? Meanwhile, back in Europe, the black market for absinthe blossomed into something stranger. Some distillers fled to Spain, where absinthe was never formally banned. Others took refuge in the Czech Republic, brewing in secrecy for niche clientele. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, rumours persisted of pre-banned bottles hidden in attics, sold quietly to collectors, or passed through generations as relics of an outlawed elegance. The lucky few who tasted them spoke of a richness, a clarity, a bite that modern spirits couldn't replicate. In truth, some of those bottles were just old, oxidized anise. But nostalgia has a way of sweetening bitterness, even the kind that stings the back of your throat. By mid-century, absinthe had become more myth than liquor. It was no longer simply something you drank. It was something you whispered about. A relic from the Belle Époque. A casualty of moral panic and artistic indulgence. The drink of Van Gogh and Toulouse-Lautrec. Of decadence, despair, and a dozen dubious hallucinations. And as always happens with myths, the longer it stayed buried, the more people wanted it back. Starting in the 1980s and growing rapidly through the 90s, a quiet resurrection began. Historians and distillers started questioning the bans. Was Thujone really so dangerous? Had anyone actually hallucinated green devils, or had they just drunk too much and misread their laundry list? The answers, as it turned out, were deeply inconvenient to prohibitionists. New scientific testing revealed that authentic absinthe, properly distilled, contained only trace amounts of thujone, nowhere near enough to cause hallucinations. The wild symptoms of absinthism, so often cited in the 19th century, more likely due to adulterants, alcoholism, or just poor life choices. In short, the Green Fairy had been framed. Armed with these revelations, craft distillers began to push back. They recreated historical recipes using old distillation methods and botanicals. They sourced archival advertisements, original bottles, forgotten journals. And in 2007, after nearly a century of stigma, absinthe was re-legalized in the United States, under the condition that its thujone content remained below regulated limits. The Green Fairy was legal again. But the world she returned to had changed. Modern absinthe, for all its authenticity, found itself navigating a new landscape, one filled with cocktail culture, Instagram filters, and ironic branding. The mystique was still there, but softer. Gone were the opium-soaked cafés and gaslit taverns. In their place were rooftop bars and mixology menus that proudly served absinthe rinses and Green Fairy foam. It wasn't quite the same. But then again, whatever is, still something remains. The spoon, the glass, the sugar cube, the drip. And in that ritual, slow, deliberate, meditative, lives a trace of what absinthe once was, an invitation to pause, to listen, to dream, to stagger slightly sideways from the expected path and into something a little stranger. And maybe that's why, even now, when you spot that pale green bottle on the back shelf of a dusty bar in New Orleans or Prague or some half-remembered alley in Marseille, your heart stirs just a little. Not because you expect to see fairies, but because you remember a time when people believed they could. Chapter 4. The Ritual and the Rush. If you've ever watched someone prepare a glass of absinthe properly, you'll know. It's not just drinking, it's theatre. And not the brash kind either. It's slow, intimate, performed with a kind of reverence that suggests the ritual matters as much as the taste, maybe even more. In a world that rushes everything, its meals, its messages, its emotions, the absinthe ritual remains gloriously stubborn. It insists that you wait, that you watch, that you listen to the whisper of water and the gentle clink of metal. And by the time the first sip reaches your lips, the drink has already told you a story. It begins with the glass, of course, always specific. Typically a Pontarlier-style vessel, broad at the base with a reservoir bulb, subtly designed to hold exactly the right amount of absinthe. This isn't a coincidence. It's deliberate engineering disguised as elegance. And above that glass rests a slotted spoon, often engraved with intricate patterns, initials, or tiny absinthe fairies dancing between the prongs. Atop that spoon sits the sugar cube, white and ordinary-looking, but destined to dissolve into something otherworldly. The next step is the slow drip of ice-cold water, traditionally from a large glass fountain with tiny brass spigots that release water one drop at a time. Yes, a fountain, not a bottle, not a jug. A four-spouted, crystal-domed apparatus that wouldn't look out of place in a cathedral or a magician's parlour. And then, slowly, almost shyly, begins the louche. As water meets absinthe, the clear emerald liquid begins to turn cloudy, opalescent, like fog rolling across a forest floor. This transformation isn't just visual, it's chemical. The essential oils in the absinthe, mainly anethol from anise, are soluble in alcohol but not in water. So, as the dilution occurs, those oils bloom into suspension, creating the milky green mist that gave absinthe its supernatural reputation. Some swore the louche had voices in it. Others claimed to see faces. At the very least, it made for excellent conversation. And as you sit there watching this slow alchemy unfold, it's hard not to feel like something significant is happening. Even if, scientifically, it's just a fancy emulsion. But the experience doesn't end with the preparation. The first sip is a test, not of courage but of palate, because absinthe isn't sweet, or soft, or shy. It bites, it coils, it spreads across the tongue with a bitterness that's both herbal and haunting. You taste fennel and anise, yes, but also something deeper. Wormwood, melissa, hyssop. Hints of alpine meadows and ghostly pharmacies, and the idea that someone, somewhere, once believed this could cure your soul. For newcomers, it's overwhelming. For devotees, it's divine. And for the absinthe drinkers of the 19th century, it was both a declaration and a defense. You didn't drink absinthe to blend in. You drank it to be seen. And people noticed, especially once the accessories came into play. Absinthe didn't just dominate cafés, it redesigned them. By the late 1800s, many Parisian bars featured dedicated absinthe stations, complete with fountains, branded glassware, and promotional posters that could pass for gallery pieces today. Distillers like Pernod Fils, Berger, and Edouard Pernod printed thousands of advertisements, each more fantastical than the last. Green fairies with flirtatious smiles. Melancholy poets gazing into their drinks like oracles. Bottles glowing like radioactive relics. It worked. The marketing fused with the ritual, and the ritual fused with the identity. Drinking absinthe wasn't about quenching thirst. It was about belonging to a mood, a moment, an era. And, inevitably, the ritual birthed its own objects of obsession. Collectors scrambled for spoons. Some were shaped like leaves, others like keys or clovers. There were regional designs, commemorative editions, even spoons made for specific cafés or events. Absinthe glasses, too, became tokens of style. Some bore etched dose lines. Others had hand-painted details or company crests. The most elaborate had silver rims and matching trays, all part of a visual choreography that made ordering an absinthe feel like setting a table for a ghost. Even the sugar cubes had a moment. Advertisers began printing logos on wrappers. Some offered collectible cube tins, and in a few cafés the sugar wasn't just dripped over, it was set on fire. Yes, flaming absinthe. A 20th century invention, often attributed to Czech bars, where the cube was soaked in high-proof absinthe, lit ablaze, and stirred into the glass. Visually stunning. Historically suspect. But once something catches fire in public, it rarely goes out quietly. Still, the true ritual, the quiet one, the French one, remained the heart of absinthe culture. The slow drip, the cloudy bloom, the patient pause. The drink demanded mindfulness in an age of acceleration. It encouraged reflection before conversation. And in a world where most people were yelling to be heard, absinthe taught you to whisper. And that was precisely its power and its threat. Because rituals, no matter how beautiful, tend to worry the authorities. The absinthe ceremony wasn't just unusual, it was subversive. It carved out spaces for idle thought, late-night debate, and poetic nonsense. It celebrated contradiction, bitterness wrapped in elegance, science married to mysticism. And in doing so, it quietly defied the industrial, mechanized, linear progress of the age. To sit for an hour, watching water fall into a glass, was an act of rebellion. To close your eyes and taste the history in the herbs, sacrilegious. To do it in public, unashamed, dangerous. So the ritual was demonized, mocked, branded as decadent, effete, and irrational. It was too French, too strange, too slow. And worst of all, it couldn't be standardized. But the beauty of ritual is that once it's been practiced enough, it doesn't die. It just goes dormant. Today, in bars scattered across cities old and new, the ritual still waits. The fountains are back. The spoons are polished. The sugar cubes are unwrapped. And somewhere, someone is watching their glass turn cloudy. Not because they need to get drunk, but because they want to remember what it feels like to let time pass without hurrying it along. Not bad for a banned beverage with a bitter bite. By now, you've seen the ritual. The slow drip, the sugar cube, the fog swirling in the glass like some ghostly bloom. You've tasted the bitterness, felt the heat in your chest. You know how it seduces. But what exactly does it do to the mind? Because for centuries, absinthe has been more than a drink. It's been a story. And not just any story, but one so riddled with fantasy and fear that it's hard to untangle fact from fable. Supposedly, this pale green elixir could make poets see angels, painters hear colours, and otherwise stable citizens hallucinate their way into psych wards. Or at least that's how the rumour went. But let's take a deep breath and look at this properly. At the heart of the myth lies a compound called thujone, found naturally in wormwood, the core botanical in absinthe. Thujone, in high doses, has been shown to cause muscle spasms and convulsions. It can be toxic. That part isn't fiction. But here's the catch. In properly distilled absinthe, the amount of thujone is tiny, often less than 10 parts per million. To experience anything close to a toxic effect, you'd have to consume so much absinthe that alcohol poisoning would take you out long before the wormwood got a chance. But nuance, as we both know, rarely survives contact with the public imagination. What did survive and flourish were decades of dramatic anecdotes. A painter wakes up surrounded by unfinished canvases and a half-written suicide note, absinthe. A writer pens 1,000 pages of gibberish in one night, absinthe. A man eats his own shoe, declares it a religious act, then faints in the street. Probably not absinthe, but close enough for the tabloids. Part of this mythology was nurtured deliberately. Artists, especially in 19th century Paris, weren't just competing with each other's work. They were competing with each other's madness. The more bizarre your behaviour, the more authentic your art. Absinthe became the drink of tortured geniuses precisely because it came with side effects you could blame your breakdowns on. And some played into it with gusto. Paul Verlaine, the famously chaotic poet, once described the feeling of absinthe as a slow explosion in the head. Never mind that Verlaine also drank brandy, laudanum, and whatever else he could get his hands on. Or that he once shot his lover in a drunken rage and blamed the stars. To the press, it was the absinthe. Always the absinthe. Charles Baudelaire, no stranger to indulgence, categorized absinthe as both a muse and a menace. He treated intoxication as a kind of sacred condition, an altered state through which the true nature of life could be glimpsed. If it came with stomach cramps and social exile, well, so much the better. And yet, for all the poetic imagery, the so-called hallucinations were likely nothing more than a cocktail of dehydration, malnutrition, sleep deprivation, and dangerously adulterated spirits. Most of the absinthe consumed by the lower classes, the people most often affected by the so-called absinthism diagnosis, was not premium Pernod. It was cheap knockoff absinthe, laced with copper salts, turpentine, or methanol. The hallucinations weren't spiritual, they were chemical, but no one wanted to hear that. Instead, a new term emerged in medical circles, absinthism. Not alcoholism, not chronic inebriation, not mercury poisoning or tuberculosis or grief. Absinthism, a fashionable new diagnosis for everything society didn't understand. Tremors, delusions, poor hygiene, bad poetry. It was a medical label that came pre-packaged with morality. You weren't just sick, you were weak, corrupted, stained green. And doctors, well, they were divided. Some clung to science, others chased headlines. A few, in fairness, just wanted to be published. Experiments were conducted with all the rigour of a tavern argument. Guinea pigs were force-fed thujone. Dogs were made to drink absinthe. Against their will, one hopes, until they collapsed. When the animals suffered seizures or died, the researchers nodded solemnly and declared the drink dangerous. You'll be shocked to learn they didn't test similar quantities of wine or whiskey for comparison. Meanwhile, the absinthe drinker remained caught between extremes. On one side, a myth of divine inspiration. The green fairy is a muse with a bittersweet kiss. On the other, a public health monster, the green devil whispering madness into the ears of fragile men. Both images were exaggerated, but both, curiously, were profitable. And that's where things get especially murky. Because, as absinthe became more infamous, it became more valuable. As a symbol, politicians could rally against it. Clerics could sermonize. Competing alcohol industries, particularly the floundering French wine lobby, could point fingers. And artists, they could claim a kind of mystical victimhood. It was a neat little package. No one had to talk about poverty, war, or mental illness. Just blame the bottle. What gets lost in all this is how ordinary absinthe often was. Most people didn't hallucinate. They didn't paint spirals or hear voices or forget their own names. They drank. They relaxed. They talked. They watched the louche curl in the glass and let their minds wander a little further than usual. Maybe that was the real magic, not hallucination, but permission. To feel strange. To think slowly. To imagine otherwise. Of course, that kind of magic is harder to legislate. And harder to sell. So the story persisted. Even after the bans, even after the science was corrected. Today, you can walk into a bar and hear a customer ask, "Will this make me see things?" They're half joking, half hoping. They want to believe the myth, because myths are more intoxicating than any drink. And maybe that's the final twist. Absinthe's greatest trick wasn't hidden in wormwood or sugar cubes or the gentle bloom of the Lausch. It was this. It made people believe they were different. Not better, not worse, just other. It offered an escape not from reality, but from expectation. It didn't show you green fairies. It showed you yourself. A little slower, a little stranger, and maybe, just maybe, a little closer to the truth. Whatever that was. Chapter 5, Art, Madness and Marketing. If there was ever a drink that knew how to sell itself, it was absinthe. Not because it was pleasant, not because it was smooth, and certainly not because it was accessible. No, absinthe knew how to sell itself because it understood something most liquor never grasped. It wasn't selling flavour, it was selling identity. To sip absinthe in 19th century Paris wasn't just to consume alcohol, it was to make a statement. A quiet, defiant, green-tinged whisper to the world that you were not like them. You, the drinker, were strange. You were sensitive. You were complicated. You were haunted, probably. Definitely misunderstood. And perhaps, with enough glasses, a genius. Or at least, that's what the posters promised. By the mid to late 1800s, absinthe had become a symbol not just of intoxication, but of artistic identity, and the marketing followed suit. All across France, advertisements began to appear on brick walls, café awnings, and newspaper pages. They weren't subtle, they didn't need to be. The most famous campaigns featured green fairies, sometimes angelic, sometimes sinister, but always seductive, fluttering around glasses, whispering into the ears of dreamy-eyed poets, or dragging respectable men into dark alleyways of the soul. One popular poster showed a woman mid-pour, absinthe cascading from bottle to glass like alchemy in motion, while her eyes stared off into the middle distance. That same vaguely melancholy gaze that was so fashionable in artistic circles. Another featured a satyr, part man, part goat, serving absinthe to a doe-eyed girl, hinting at both danger and desire in one surreal frame. This wasn't just advertising, it was aspiration. The drink wasn't just sold to people, it was sold as people. The aloof poet, the sensual muse, the rebellious painter with a questionable diet and even more questionable hygiene. Absinthe wasn't marketing to the masses. It was marketing to the myth inside each person who'd ever scribbled in a notebook or sighed at the moon. And it worked. Walk into a Paris café in 1895 and you'd find the place crawling with characters who, had absinthe never existed, would have had to invent it just to give themselves something to suffer with. Young men in threadbare waistcoats reciting verses no one asked for. Women with inkwells in their handbags and manifestos in their pockets. Everyone performing a little, pretending they weren't pretending, and holding a glass that gleamed green under the gaslight. And the artists? Oh, they leaned into it hard. Toulouse-Lautrec, whose posters for the Moulin Rouge remain iconic, didn't just drink absinthe, he lived in it. His colours seemed to pulse with the same eerie glow found in a freshly prepared glass. The wild lines, the blurred edges, the haunted expressions, all of it fed by a lifestyle soaked in booze and smoke, and that lingering promise that art born of suffering was more real. Van Gogh, though more complex and tragic, was inevitably linked to absinthe in the public mind. His brilliant colours and spiralling forms were interpreted not just as mental illness, but as wormwood visions. A convenient explanation, really. Blame the bottle instead of the world that abandoned him. Even writers, not to be outdone by their oil-smudged counterparts, turned absinthe into a literary tool. Baudelaire wrote of intoxication as a sacred duty. Rimbaud wandered across Europe in a drunken haze, scrawling verse and breaking hearts. Wilde, always performative, famously quipped that, after the first glass of absinthe you see things as you wish they were, after the second you see them as they are not, and finally you see things as they really are, and that is the most horrible thing in the world. To be fair, Wilde also drank champagne for breakfast, so his scale may have been skewed. Still, Absinthe's artistic credentials became self-reinforcing. The more artists consumed it, the more people believed it inspired them. And the more people believed it inspired them, the more artists drank it. Not necessarily for inspiration, but for legitimacy. If you weren't at least a little broken, who would take your work seriously? It was an era when pain was fashionable and self-destruction could be monetized, at least until your liver gave out. Publishers, critics, gallery owners, they all benefited from the image. The myth of the absinthe-fueled genius sold books, paintings, posters. It filled seats and drove gossip. And if a few of the artists collapsed young, well, so much the better. There's nothing like a tragic early death to drive up the price of your work. It's a cynical loop, but not a new one. Culture has always been strangely comfortable commodifying suffering, so long as it's romanticized just enough to keep it at a safe distance. And yet, for all the performance and profit, it would be wrong to dismiss the absinthe-era creatives as mere victims of trend or marketing. They were trying, in their way, to find truth in a world that increasingly felt mechanical, rigid, and unforgiving. The industrial age brought noise, smog, bureaucracy. Absinthe offered fog, slowness, a suspension of expectation. It gave artists permission to drift, and in that drift they sometimes found something real. Of course, not everything produced under the green glow was a masterpiece. For every Verlaine poem, there were 10 drunken rants scribbled on bar napkins. For every Lautrec lithograph, there were a dozen half-finished sketches stained with wine. But even the failures contributed to the myth. Absinthe didn't just produce genius, it produced attempts. Glorious, messy, occasionally embarrassing attempts to make sense of a world in flux. And maybe that's where its strange power lay. It wasn't a guaranteed shortcut to creativity. It was a companion, a bitter, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous one, but a companion nonetheless. It reminded people that art didn't need to be clean, or structured, or even good. It just needed to be felt. And when you held that glass, watched the louche bloom, and felt the world shift just slightly off its axis, you remembered, if only for a moment. That being a little unsteady was part of the point. By the turn of the 20th century, absinthe wasn't just a drink. It was a stage, a symbol, a scapegoat. It filled canvases and crime reports in equal measure, weaving itself into the fabric of an era that didn't quite know whether to celebrate its eccentricity or condemn it outright. It had become, quite literally, the spirit of the age, intoxicating, controversial, and impossible to ignore. But here's the problem with turning something into a symbol. Eventually, people start using it to explain everything they can't. And so, beneath the layers of art and advertising, a tension began to build, one that would slowly unravel the myth that had been so carefully constructed. Because, for all the glamour, all the ritual, all the foggy afternoons spent watching poets dissolve into their notebooks, there was something else happening too, something harder to paint. People were starting to get sick. Not from the absinthe itself, necessarily, at least not the properly distilled kind, but from the sheer volume of it, and from the cheap imitations flooding the market. In the less elegant parts of town, you could get a glass for a few centimes, and what you were drinking bore little resemblance to the bottled elegance served in Montmartre cafés. These knock-off concoctions often contained industrial alcohols, metallic dyes, even petroleum byproducts. It was absinthe in name only, and poison in everything else. But nuance is a fragile thing, and rather than distinguish between the artisan and the imitator, society began to lump all absinthe together. All of it was suspect, all of it corrupting. The same posters that once featured dreamy fairies and artistic melancholy began to shift in tone. New illustrations appeared, grotesque parodies of absinthe drinkers, wide-eyed and broken, collapsing into alleyways or clawing at hallucinations. The green fairy became a green demon. It didn't help that absinthe had become a convenient villain in the ongoing cultural tug-of-war between progress and tradition. The industrial world wanted order, discipline, and predictability. Absinthe was chaotic, poetic, and defiantly slow. Middle-class families, eager to separate themselves from the moral ambiguities of the artistic class, found in absinthe a useful line in the sand. "We drink wine," they might say, "with our dinner. You drink absinthe with your regrets." Even among the medical establishment, opinions split sharply. Some doctors defended the drink, not necessarily because they believed in its benefits, but because they knew that alcohol abuse was not a mystery specific to absinthe. Others took a harsher line, diagnosing an entire syndrome, absinthism. It sounded scientific, it sounded dangerous, and it made for excellent headlines. Symptoms included hallucinations, seizures, rapid mood swings, and cognitive decline, all of which, as modern researchers now point out, can be explained by chronic alcoholism alone. Still, the idea took hold. Absinthe was no longer just a drink of the decadent. It was a disease of the weak. But perhaps the harshest backlash came not from doctors or critics, but from a growing cultural movement that sought to restore moral clarity, or at least the appearance of it. Temperance societies had already been pushing for alcohol reform, but absinthe gave them something new, a specific enemy. A drink with a face, a colour, a smell, a ritual. Something that felt foreign and theatrical, and therefore suspicious. It didn't matter that wine caused more liver damage, or that beer fueled just as many drunken fights. Absinthe had too much symbolism to survive scrutiny. It was radical. It was artistic. And worst of all, it was popular among people who didn't care what the neighbours thought. So the sermons began. Churches denounced absinthe as a liquid devil. Mothers were warned that a single sip would corrupt their sons. Wives were told their husband's temper wasn't due to stress or war or exhaustion. It was absinthe. Politicians, eager to ride the wave, began promising reform. And quietly, behind the stained glass windows and polished oak desks, the bans were drafted. Absinthe would soon face legal extinction in one country after another. But before that, in these last years of its golden age, the drink became strangely self-aware. You could see it in the posters. Absinthe ads began to grow defensive, almost pleading. They emphasized elegance, purity, respectability. One showed a mother pouring a glass while her children read quietly nearby, as if to say, "See, no madness here. Just a tasteful buzz." Others leaned into the artistry, highlighting the craftsmanship of the distillation, the natural herbs, the tradition behind the ritual. But the damage was done. Absinthe had become a cultural Rorschach test. To some, it was still a symbol of liberation, of creativity, rebellion, and freedom from bourgeois expectations. To others, it was a symptom of decay, a green stain on the fabric of civilized life. And the louder each side shouted, the less room there was for truth. And what was the truth? That absinthe, like most things, wasn't one thing. It was many things. A tool, a mask, a myth, a mirror. It was an excuse, a habit, a pleasure, and sometimes, yes, a problem. But rarely in the way people claimed. Because if you strip away the marketing, the fear-mongering, the late-night hallucinations and candlelit poems, you're left with something surprisingly ordinary. A strong, herbal liquor that tasted like black licorice and nostalgia, consumed by people trying to make sense of the world in whatever way they could. And maybe that's the tragedy. Not that absinthe was banned, but that the conversation around it became so one-sided, so riddled with panic and performance, that no one stopped to ask why people loved it in the first place. It wasn't the hallucinations. It wasn't even the drunkenness. It was the ritual, the slowness, the space it carved out in a world that was increasingly noisy and mechanical. It was a small rebellion, poured into a wide-bottomed glass and sweetened with a single cube of sugar. And like all good rebellions, it was never going to last forever. There's a peculiar charm to watching people pretend they're not performing. In cafés, in salons, at dinner parties, wherever absinthe found its way into the social bloodstream, it turned ordinary lives into quiet little dramas. Not because the drink demanded it, but because the people who drank it did. By the late 19th century, absinthe wasn't just a bohemian badge or a criminal curiosity. It had, quite remarkably, become fashionable. It was the centre of elegant conversation, the lubricant of awkward flirtations, and the unspoken excuse behind 1,000 dubious decisions. It sat on side tables in drawing rooms, in back pockets during strolls through the Luxembourg Gardens, even on the occasional nightstand, a soft green whisper at the end of the day. And with that shift came something stranger, absinthe as performance. It began, as it often does, with imitation. The artistic elite had glamorized absinthe into a kind of lifestyle, and the middle classes, never ones to resist a good trend, wanted in. They may not have had poetry in their veins or unpaid rent in their pockets, but they had aspirations and, more importantly, disposable income. So they bought the spoons. They ordered the glasses. They installed fountains in parlours and learned the proper ratios by heart. A dash of absinthe, a sugar cube, slow water drip, not too fast, not too slow. It became a party trick, a conversation piece, a way to signal not just taste, but culture. If you could master the ritual, you could imply you understood something deeper, something poetic, something dangerous but manageable, like keeping a tiger in the drawing room just to prove you weren't afraid of the wild. This was indulgence by design, but it wasn't just about showing off. It was also about controlling the chaos. The late Victorian world was obsessed with order, social, moral, architectural. Yet absinthe offered a tiny, acceptable transgression, a way to taste rebellion without stepping too far from respectability. You could loosen your tie, slouch a little, speak a little too candidly, all under the gentle cover of that unmistakable green fog. And society permitted it, within limits. It became fashionable to indulge, but only if one did so elegantly. The respectable classes developed their own code of absinthe etiquette. 1 glass in the afternoon? Acceptable. 2? Still charming if you could hold a conversation. 3 or more? Now you were becoming that kind of person, the sort whispered about, not invited back. There was an unspoken expectation. Be interesting, but not unstable. Be curious, but not corrupted. Let the absinthe loosen you, but not unhinge you. It was a narrow bridge, and many walked it daily, teetering between allure and scandal. And that's where the performances began to crack, because for every man who held court over a glass of green liquid, reciting half-remembered Latin and misquoting Voltaire, there was another who stumbled into the gutter outside, having mistaken poetry for permission. For every woman who sipped absinthe with deliberate restraint, there was another who drank to forget her marriage, her mourning, or the simple grinding boredom of her days. Behind the curated scenes of drawing rooms and late-night salons, real consequences simmered. Absinthe began appearing in divorce proceedings, in newspaper headlines, in medical reports. Public disorder charges mentioned it. So did complaints from landlords, worried about tenants who'd replace breakfast with bitterness and water. It wasn't always dramatic. Most of the time, it was quiet, a slow erosion, a habit that began as ritual and ended as reflex. But even then, even as whispers turned to warnings, many clung to the romance of it all. Because absinthe, unlike any other drink of the time, had successfully marketed melancholy. It allowed people to feel tragic without being tragic, to wallow just enough to seem deep without fully drowning. And for a society that often prized appearances over authenticity, that was a powerful seduction. It's no wonder, then, that entire industries sprang up to support it. There were absinthe salons, distinct from traditional cafés, quieter, more refined, where the ritual was honoured like a ceremony. There were travelling absinthe exhibitions hosted in hotels and banquet halls, where attendees could sample different blends, compare louche colours, and argue over regional herb profiles like sommeliers of despair. Some cafés hired absinthe experts whose job was to mix, pour, and explain the history of the drink with just enough flair to justify the inflated price. They became part bartender, part performer, part historian. An early form of branded storytelling, wrapped in a waistcoat and garnished with trivia. Even fashion was touched. Accessories were designed to complement the ritual. Pocket flasks shaped like mini carafes, jewellery inspired by the spiral of a spoon, green gloves, absinthe-toned scarves. A whole palette of colours emerged, aimed at replicating the soft hues of a louche in the sunlight. If you couldn't be an artist, you could at least dress like someone who might inspire one. But with visibility comes vulnerability. As absinthe entered more homes, more hearts, and more headlines, the criticism intensified. Not from radicals or clergy, but from those most invested in the illusion of control. The ones who believed that if you dressed indulgence in silk and silver, it stopped being dangerous. They were wrong, because the truth was, absinthe didn't care how you performed it. It didn't care if you poured it slowly or recklessly, whether your spoon was antique or borrowed, whether your poem was publishable or gibberish. It was a mirror, and for many, what it reflected wasn't poetry. It was longing, for escape, for expression, for something unspoken that the world around them had no room for. And in that longing there was danger, because performance can only mask so much. Eventually, the glass empties, the room grows quiet, the green fades, and what's left is the person behind the pose, uncertain, unresolved, and still reaching for a ritual to make sense of it all. But not just yet. For now, the cafés are still lit, the spoons still shine, the sugar still waits patiently atop the glass, and somewhere, someone takes their seat at a marble-top table, stirs slowly, and begins their performance. Again, there's a point in every great performance where the spotlight lingers just a little too long. The lines grow stale, the costumes look worn, and the audience begins to shift in their seats, not because they're offended, but because they're no longer enchanted. That's where absinthe found itself by the first years of the 20th century. Still present, still poured, but no longer untouchable. The rituals remained. The spoon still gleamed under cafe lights. But something had changed. What was once mystical began to feel mechanical. Absinthe's popularity, once born of poetry and rebellion, had become a kind of routine. The drink was no longer whispered about in back rooms or celebrated in bohemian salons. It had become a habit, a visible one. And with visibility came scrutiny. And nothing invites scrutiny like routine indulgence done in public. Across Europe, particularly in France and Switzerland, temperance societies were gaining momentum. Their meetings were orderly, well-lit, and often included pamphlets filled with shaking hands, jaundiced skin, and wide-eyed depictions of men driven to madness. No one attending these gatherings had seen a green fairy themselves, but they'd read about plenty. And that was more than enough. Moral panic doesn't need evidence, it just needs a good story. And absinthe gave them one. It had a colour, a ritual, a reputation. It was foreign, herbaceous, vaguely medicinal, and very much not wine. That last part mattered, because while absinthe was being targeted as a public danger, wine, especially in France, was elevated as the national drink of reason, health, and virtue. A glass of wine with dinner? Civilized. A glass of absinthe at 4 p.m. Degeneracy. Behind much of this judgment was a not-so-subtle class divide. Wine had rural roots, family heritage, agricultural romance. Absinthe was urban, synthetic, popular among artists, anarchists, and factory workers, the types who either questioned the system or had been failed by it. The stage was set, and the performance, pure theatrical morality. Newspapers ran sensational stories, rarely fact-checked, often entirely invented, about absinthe, crazed husbands murdering their wives, mothers abandoning their children, and once promising scholars reduced to stammering lunatics. One Swiss story in particular gripped the public imagination, the infamous case of Jean Lanfray, a man who, in 1905, murdered his entire family after a day of drinking, including, yes, 2 glasses of absinthe. Not 50, not a bottle, just 2. Never mind the fact that Lanfray had consumed enough wine and brandy to tranquilize a racehorse. The press pounced on the absinthe angle, and suddenly it became the killer in the bottle. That one story changed everything. Over 80,000 Swiss citizens signed a petition demanding a ban. And they got one. By 1910, absinthe was outlawed in Switzerland. Other countries followed: Belgium, Brazil, eventually the United States. France, the birthplace of modern absinthe culture, resisted longest. But the whispers were growing louder, and behind the scenes, the wine industry was stirring the pot with remarkable enthusiasm. You see, when phylloxera devastated French vineyards in the late 19th century, wine production plummeted. Absinthe filled the void. It was cheap, shelf-stable, and didn't rely on insect-riddled grapevines. For a while, absinthe wasn't just fashionable, it was practical. But once the wine industry recovered, they wanted their market share back. And absinthe, with its scandalous stories and conveniently green tint, made the perfect villain. Doctors were trotted out in front of lawmakers. Charts were waved, diagrams shown, speeches given about neurotoxicity and degeneration, and the moral rot spreading through the streets of Paris. Even the word absinthe began to feel loaded, a shorthand for everything conservative society feared: freedom, creativity, disorder, and worst of all, change. Meanwhile, the cafés tried to pretend everything was fine. In Montmartre, performers still sang beneath flickering gas lamps. Painters still sat hunched over half-finished canvases, their brushes dry but their glasses full. Writers still filled notebooks with elliptical thoughts, convincing themselves the next line would make it all make sense. But there was a kind of pressure in the air now, like a summer storm refusing to break. A waiter might hesitate before bringing that second glass. A wife might ask her husband not to drink in front of the children. A politician might decline an invitation to an absinthe salon just to avoid being seen. The glamour was cracking. And what emerged beneath wasn't shocking. It was ordinary despair. People drank too much. They argued. They forgot appointments. They wept into tablecloths. And because it was absinthe, and because absinthe had become a symbol, each of these mundane misfortunes was elevated to a warning sign of civil collapse. But in truth, the collapse was already happening. Not from wormwood, not from thujone, but from systems that were already beginning to fail, the people leaning too heavily on a green glass for relief. Industrialization was speeding up. Wages were stagnating. The world was getting louder, colder, more mechanical. And absinthe, for all its mystery and menace, had become a temporary escape, not a poison, but a pause. That's what the critics never understood. They saw addiction. What they missed was ritual dependence, which is not always the same as substance dependence. They saw hallucinations. What they missed were metaphors. They saw decline. What they missed was the desperate attempt to remain human in a world that increasingly demanded gears instead of feelings. Of course, none of that made it into the legislation. In 1915, as Europe edged toward the abyss of war, France officially banned absinthe, not with fire or riots, but with paperwork. It was quietly removed from shops, from menus, from public life. Fountains were dismantled, posters taken down, labels rewritten to disguise what the bottle truly contained. It was over, at least in public. The green fairy, for all her ethereal presence, had slipped out the back door. Chapter 7. The Moral Curtain Falls. When governments finally banned absinthe, they didn't do so with bonfires or raids. No torches, no shouting mobs, just ink on paper. A decree. A law. A paragraph buried deep in the Gazette. It was, in many ways, the most polite prohibition in history. A quiet, bureaucratic sigh, aimed less at the drink itself and more at the theatre it had come to represent. And so, without a single shattered bottle or overturned café table, the Green Fairy was dismissed from public life. It would be tempting to imagine a collective relief, society dusting its hands and declaring a victory over madness. But the truth, as it so often is, was a little messier. The absinthe ban didn't usher in sobriety. It didn't spark a moral renaissance. It didn't even slow the rise of other intoxicants. What it did do, quite effectively, was offer the illusion of order. That's what prohibition often is, a performance of control in a world spiralling beyond anyone's grasp. In France, once the absinthe decree passed in 1915, café owners were told to remove bottles from display. Fountains were quietly boxed up and sent to storage. Glasses were washed one last time, stacked and forgotten. For a while it was said that you could walk down Rue Saint-Denis and see dozens of green-glassed windows gone dark overnight, a kind of urban eclipse. But here's the part no one wants to admit. Absinthe didn't really disappear. It just changed clothes. Manufacturers, always a few clever steps ahead of the law, began tweaking recipes. They created new spirits that walked, talked, and poured like absinthe, just without the forbidden name. Labels were rewritten. Wormwood content was adjusted. Sugar levels fiddled. Bottles once stamped absinthe were now called anise, la verte, or simply herbal liqueur. The drink still glowed faintly green. It still clouded when water touched it. It still had that sharp herbal kick. And people still drank it. Because the public, despite all the panic and pamphlets, hadn't fallen out of love with absinthe. Not really. They had merely been told to pretend they had. And like any forbidden fruit, its absence made the longing sweeter. The act of drinking it became not a habit, but a subtle rebellion. Of course, some took that further. Illegal distilleries cropped up, especially in the countryside. Hidden stills bubbled behind farmhouses. Recipes passed in whispers. In some circles, serving genuine absinthe became a status symbol, a sign that you weren't afraid of the state's wagging finger, that you remembered a time when drinking was an art, not a risk assessment. Meanwhile, the moralizers celebrated. They wrote editorials. They published statistics. They hosted abstinence conferences with banners that read like battle cries. Wormwood is defeated. France is clean again. The green plague is gone. Except it wasn't. It had simply gone underground. And what replaced it above ground was, in many ways, worse. The absinthe ban did not reduce drinking. It redirected it. In the absence of the old ritual, drinkers turned to cheaper, faster, less poetic options. High-proof spirits that didn't require fountains or spoons, just a willing mouth and a bad day. Brandy. Cheap anisette. Industrial-grade substitutes. The Green Fairy had left the stage, but the audience still wanted a show. And what they got was louder, harsher, and far less elegant. The government, however, remained committed to the performance. They presented the ban as a triumph of science, citing thujone toxicity and neural degeneration. Never mind that the quantities needed to produce those effects were well beyond what any glass could deliver. Never mind that modern research would later show absinthe's effects were mostly due to its alcohol content, not wormwood-induced madness. But then again, moral panic has always outrun evidence. The cultural narrative had already been written. Absinthe was the villain. It was the drink that destroyed minds, ruined families, inspired crimes, and lured poets to early graves. It was the hallucinogenic heart of a decadent era. And banning it wasn't just about removing a beverage. It was about reasserting control over a society that had become too expressive, too emotional, too unpredictable. It was a statement, this is where the line is, and we will not cross it, even as they quietly stepped over it in their own homes. Because many of those who voted for prohibition didn't stop drinking, they just switched spirits. They poured white wine instead of green liqueur. They toasted with brandy instead of absinthe. The act remained, only the label changed. And isn't that always the way? Real reform is hard. Rebranding is easier. The irony, of course, is that absinthe's very mythology only deepened in its absence. Writers who had once sipped it now wrote about it in reverent tones, casting it as the last muse of a fading age. Painters memorialized it in canvas swirls. Collectors scoured antique shops for spoons and glasses. Absinthe became nostalgia bottled, a symbol of lost glamour, artistic freedom, and a time when rebellion could be poured with sugar and stirred with ritual. And for those too young to remember its original reign, the mystique was even stronger. They hadn't seen the gutter poets or the stumbling philosophers. They only saw the posters, elegant women in green gowns, dancing with bottles. They read the poems, heard the rumours. They wanted to taste what had been taken away. That longing simmered for decades. And so, quietly, softly, absinthe survived, in basements, in notebooks, in paintings, in the dust of a forgotten fountain, in the residue of an antique spoon, in the lips of a grandmother who once drank it on the Riviera and never told her children. Because you can ban a drink, you can outlaw a ritual, but you can't erase memory. And absinthe had become something more than alcohol. It was a performance, a protest, a poem. And that kind of thing doesn't die easy. It waits. And by the late 20th century, it would begin, ever so slowly, to return. Absinthe didn't claw its way back into the world. It tiptoed, quietly, like a spirit returning to a room that no longer recognized its scent. Decades had passed since the ban. The world had changed. Wars had come and gone. Empires had collapsed. New gods had risen. Television, capitalism, nuclear anxiety. And through it all, the green fairy stayed silent, exiled to memory, myth, and the backs of dusty shelves. But the thing about memory is, it ferments. What began as forbidden became fashionable. What was once condemned grew mysterious. In the underground bars of Paris, in certain corners of Prague, in hushed Swiss kitchens, whispers of absinthe lingered like incense. Artists still name-dropped it. Collectors hoarded antique bottles as if they were holy relics. And tourists, ever drawn to the scent of rebellion, began to ask about that drink, the green one, the dangerous one. Meanwhile, science, ever the inconvenient cousin of moral crusades, started doing what it does best, testing old claims. By the late 20th century, studies began examining thujone, the compound in wormwood accused of sparking hallucinations, madness, and murder. The results? Deflating, if you're a prohibitionist. It turned out that the amount of thujone in vintage absinthe was far too low to cause anything resembling psychosis. No green fairies, no homicidal fits. No artistic genius squeezed from a poisoned brain. Just alcohol. Strong, aromatic, and occasionally very poorly handled alcohol. And yet, that finding cracked open the door, because now absinthe could claim it had been misunderstood, vilified, wrongfully accused. It wasn't a danger. It was a victim of bad science and good propaganda. And nothing sells like a comeback story. So, slowly, countries began to reconsider. Cautiously. First, they allowed thujone-containing wormwood extracts for herbal medicine. Then a few distillers in Eastern Europe began bottling green liqueurs that looked suspiciously like absinthe, but carried vague, legally ambiguous names like Absinthe Originale or Herbal Spirit 55. They sold well. Too well to ignore. By the 1990s, France, the country that once waged moral war on absinthe, quietly legalized absinthe-like spirits, provided they met strict chemical standards. Thujone levels had to remain below a certain threshold. Labels couldn't make absurd promises. No fairies, please, just facts. But facts were never Absinthe's strong suit. Myth was. So when it returned, it did so with style. Not as a drink, but as an event. Bars began stocking proper glassware again, those heavy-bottomed goblets with etched measurements. Spoons reappeared, pierced, elegant, waiting for sugar cubes. Fountains gurgled in corners, their taps poised like tiny silver swans. And when the water dripped over the sugar, the crowd leaned in, not because they needed to understand, but because they needed to feel something. That's the secret of Absinthe's rebirth. It wasn't just about taste. It was about theatre. About recapturing a time when drinking wasn't functional. It was expressive. It told a story. It slowed time. And it required tools. This revival wasn't global at first. The United States, for example, held on to its ban longer than most. But Americans being Americans, that didn't stop them from importing absinthe from Czech distillers, many of whom cared more about shock value than authenticity. These early products were green, yes, but often neon, and flavoured with artificial bitterness that missed the subtle anise-tinged complexity of traditional recipes. Still, they sold, loudly. And that, predictably, prompted questions. By the early 2000s, pressure was mounting. If Thujone wasn't dangerous, if real absinthe could be made safely, why was it still illegal? Why were distillers forced to skirt around the name, play chemistry games, or pretend their products were something else entirely? Eventually, the US caved, but again, politely. In 2007, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau approved the sale of absinthe that met modern safety standards. Thujone levels had to stay below 10 parts per million. Labels had to include certain warnings, but the word absinthe could return. At last. And return it did. Suddenly, bottles flooded the market. Some tried to mimic Belle Époque designs, Art Nouveau lettering, green glass, vintage charm. Others leaned hard into the myth skulls, ravens, mysterious eyes. Some promised authenticity, quoting 19th century recipes. Others promised visions, though couched in poetic terms, lest regulators raise an eyebrow. Distilleries, new and old, began competing not just on flavour, but on legacy. We use original stills, one might boast. Our recipe comes from 1855, claimed another. Ours is distilled in the Alps by monks, using forgotten herbs that bloom only on equinoxes. Possibly true. Probably not. In this crowded marketplace, authenticity became as much a marketing tool as the drink itself. Drinkers weren't just buying alcohol, they were buying a story, a sense of connection to a past that felt rebellious, romantic, and just dangerous enough to feel interesting without being irresponsible. But here's the irony. Maybe even the quiet tragedy of absinthe's revival, for all its mystery, all its ritual, all its whispered promises, it's just a drink now. A legal one. A bottled one. Sanitized, measured, and regulated to the decimal. No more poison warnings. No more poets claiming madness. No more police raids in smoky cafés. Just a shelf in the liquor store, nestled between pastis and gin, waiting for someone curious enough to pay a little extra for a bottle of nostalgia. Which, let's be honest, is how most rebellions end. Not with a revolution, but with a barcode. That doesn't make it meaningless. The ritual still has power. The louche still clouds the glass like a little ghost. The first sip still carries that herbal bite, that whisper of alpine bitterness, that suggestion that something wilder lies beneath. But it's no longer forbidden. And maybe that's the final magic trick. Absinthe, once condemned as corrupting, seductive, and subversive, now lives on legally, tastefully, even respectably. It survived prohibition, panic, and propaganda, not by fighting back, but by waiting. And now, at long last, you can drink it legally, under the same laws that once tried to erase it. Not bad for a little green fairy. Chapter 8. Green in the glass, gold in the market. Absinthe's return to legality wasn't the end of the story, it was the start of a reinvention. Now that the green fairy had fluttered her way back into the hands of law-abiding drinkers, the question shifted from, can you drink it, to how much can you sell it for? And this, perhaps more than any hallucination or moral panic, became the real story of absinthe in the 21st century. Not as poison, not as potion, but as product. Because once something is legal, the next step is simple, you brand it. The modern world, ever hungry for luxury with a splash of danger, greeted absinthe's return with open wallets and a slightly theatrical gasp. This wasn't the bitter medicine of 19th century French soldiers anymore. It wasn't the poetic lubricant of starving artists. It wasn't even the rumoured madness in a glass that your eccentric uncle used to whisper about. No, this new absinthe came dressed for the upscale dinner party. Sleek, sophisticated, and expensive. The first thing to change was the bottle. Gone were the utilitarian shapes of old distilleries. In their place stood embossed glass, matte finishes, wax seals, and hand-numbered labels. Every detail screaming artisan and exclusive. Fonts flirted with Gothic curves. Labels boasted of original Belle Époque recipes, even when the distillery had been founded in 2018 by 3 ex-marketing executives from Berlin. But who could resist? Because for a generation raised on craft cocktails and curated experiences, absinthe wasn't just alcohol, it was an aesthetic. Green, mysterious, ritualistic, Instagrammable. A drink that required a spoon, a sugar cube, and a 5-minute preparation process was no longer a barrier. It was a feature. Bars leaned into this with performative flair. Ordering absinthe became a kind of mini-theatre. The bartender, suddenly a priest of forgotten rites, would bring out the special glass, the perforated spoon, the sugar cube balanced like an offering. Then came the slow pour of ice water, one drip at a time, transforming the green clarity into a cloudy swirl. Patrons watched in silence, some filming on their phones, as if witnessing a sacred event. And, in a way, they were. Only the god wasn't Dionysus anymore. It was capital. Because while absinthe's mystique was born in smoke-filled Montmartre cafés, its modern power lives in boardrooms. Global beverage companies quickly noticed the trend. They saw young consumers chasing authentic experiences, and nothing says authentic like a drink once banned for driving poets insane. So the corporations moved in, some resurrecting old brand names from defunct archives, others creating new ones with invented backstories polished to a fine, seductive shine. Each bottle had a tale to tell. One claimed to follow a secret 1867 recipe discovered in a locked Parisian cellar. Another whispered of an ancestor who distilled absinthe illegally during the war and passed down the formula like a family heirloom. Still another insisted that its wormwood was harvested by hand beneath the same moonlight Van Gogh once painted by. Were these stories true? Possibly, but also possibly not. And more importantly, no one cared. The myth was part of the marketing. The price tags told their own story. A standard 705 ml bottle of absinthe, regardless of authenticity, could now fetch anywhere from $60 to $300. Limited editions, released in velvet boxes or signed by the master distiller, could go higher. And while true connoisseurs might debate the quality, most buyers weren't chasing subtle differences in wormwood aroma. They were buying status. A liquid badge of the educated drinker. The worldly one. The one who doesn't just want a cocktail, they want a conversation starter. Restaurants caught on too. Suddenly, absinthe fountains appeared on rooftop lounges. Tasting flights became part of upscale menus. And with them came new rituals. Absinthe night. Green hour happy hour. Even absinthe pairings with modern cuisine, where roasted duck was served with a shot of liquid anise and a side of curated backstory. This, perhaps, was the biggest shift of all. Absinthe had gone from cultural rebel to curated experience. A drink that once symbolized rejection of bourgeois norms now starred in tasting menus priced at $200 a seat. In fairness, some modern distillers do aim for historical accuracy. They pore over century-old records, measure Thujaune to the decimal, and hunt down antique stills. These purists argue that absinthe's soul lies not in its branding, but in its balance. The delicate harmony between wormwood, anise, fennel, and lesser herbs. To them, what matters isn't the font on the bottle or the influencer holding it, but the louche, the milky bloom that reveals whether the drink is truly alive. But they're the minority. The majority of consumers wouldn't know a Pontalia style from a Bohemian style if it danced across their tongue in a tutu. They want the story, the feel, the aesthetic of danger, now neatly bottled and regulated. And the industry, ever attuned to demand, gives them exactly that. Sometimes with artificial colouring, sometimes with more sugar than style, but always with a label that whispers, once banned, now back. There's a quiet irony here. The very forces that once sought to destroy absinthe bureaucracy, public morality, profit, now shape its second life. It's being tamed, taxed, trademarked, its image curated by marketers, its rituals scripted by mixologists, its rebellion replaced by branding guides and SEO strategies. And yet, somehow, it still works. Because even in this polished form, absinthe remains one of the few drinks that demands your attention. You can't slam it. You don't chug it between dance floor sprints. You sit. You prepare. You wait. And in that pause, in that slowness, lies the echo of its old power. Not madness, not visions, but memory. The memory of a time when people drank not to forget, but to feel. When artists toasted to confusion. When every sip was a tiny rebellion. That memory, more than the drink itself, is what sells now. And so, absinthe persists. Not as a vice, not even as a virtue, but as a vintage mood, carefully bottled and labelled for a world that needs its chaos pre-approved by customs. In a world where brands die quietly and trends vanish before the ice melts in your drink, absinthe has done something strangely impressive. It stuck around, not because everyone drinks it, but because everyone knows about it. Even if they've never smelled wormwood, never watched water drip onto a sugar cube, never felt the anise cloud melt across their tongue, they know absinthe. Or at least they think they do. That's the power of myth. It seeps in, finds a seat in the back of your mind, and waits for someone to strike a match. By the time the early 2000s turn their gaze toward vintage aesthetics and gothic nostalgia, absinthe had already rebranded itself without changing a single drop. It wasn't just a drink anymore. It was a symbol. And symbols, unlike flavours, never go out of style. In cinema, it became a visual shortcut for decadence, danger, and artistic doom. Watch carefully, and you'll see it lurking like a green spectre in countless period pieces and noir dreams. Baz Luhrmann's Moulin Rouge didn't just feature absinthe, it gave her form. The Green Fairy, played by Kylie Minogue, dances on screen in a glittering hallucination, mixing the glamorous with the grotesque. In From Hell, Johnny Depp's character downs glass after glass as he tries to commune with the darkness. Absinthe here is no longer a beverage. It's a mood, a visual spell. Green glass, slow pour, candlelight flickering like memory. But pop culture did more than romanticize absinthe. It flattened it. Suddenly, every college costume party had a green fairy with glitter and wings. Bars offered absinthe shots made from neon-coloured syrup with enough sugar to tranquilize a moose. Some drinks, laughably, were simply vodka dyed green and sold under names like Wormwood Wizard or Psychedelic Punch, with nary a trace of wormwood in sight. And yet, somehow, the myth still held. tourist traps in Prague began offering absinthe experiences, where fire was involved, not in distillation, but in setting sugar cubes ablaze in dimly lit rooms for maximum drama. The flames had no historical basis. No Belle Époque bohemian ever torched their sugar like a flaming sambuca. But that didn't matter. This was about effect, not accuracy. People wanted to feel like they were doing something dangerous, even if it was pre-approved by TripAdvisor. Meanwhile, back in the quieter corners of the spirits world, true absinthe makers watched with a mix of amusement and quiet horror. Their drink, lovingly restored with antique recipes and copper stills, was now competing with green cough syrup cocktails marketed as absinthe bombs. The same myths that had once damned absinthe as a menace were now helping sell knockoffs at beach bars and club chains. That duality, reverence and ridicule, is absinthe's modern curse. It lives in two worlds. In one, it's a serious, complex spirit with a rich cultural and botanical heritage. In the other, it's a cartoon, a prop, a green meme served with fire and false promises. There's a kind of tragicomedy in that, because while Scotch whisky gets its documentaries and wine gets its critics, absinthe gets TikTok tutorials where people mispronounce anise and claim to see visions after one sugary shot. It's the only drink that still carries a built-in dare. Will it make me hallucinate? No. Will it drive me mad? Only if you believe everything you read on Reddit. And still, it sells. Not in massive numbers. Absinthe will never outsell vodka. It won't replace gin at your local bar. It's too strong, too strange, too ritualistic. But it doesn't need to win by volume. It wins by presence. It's the bottle on the top shelf, glowing softly like a relic. It's the drink you try once and remember forever. It's the thing you serve to guests not to refresh them, but to impress them. And let's not ignore the economics of that. Because in a market saturated with craft beers and micro-distilled gins, absinthe offers something rare, built-in lore. You don't need to invent a backstory for absinthe. It comes with one. It's got murder trials, medical panics, banned posters, and dead poets in its luggage. It's got enough vintage controversy to keep marketers busy for decades. So it continues, this strange double life. In some circles, it's treated with the respect of fine brandy sipped slowly, discussed quietly, savoured like liquid time. In others, it's a Halloween punchline, dyed radioactive green and sold with glow sticks. And in between, it's a curiosity, a drink you try once, maybe twice, just to say you've danced with the fairy and survived. What's remarkable is how absinthe endures all this with grace. Other spirits might suffer under such contradictions, but absinthe seems almost built for it. It was born in paradox, bitter, yet sweet, medical, yet mystical, a drink of peasants and princes alike. It was blamed for madness, praised for genius, banned for sin, and celebrated for art. Perhaps that's why it survives. Because unlike vodka, which demands to be flavourless, or tequila, which demands a lime and a wince, absinthe demands nothing except time. Time to drip, time to cloud, time to sit and wonder, what did they see in this? And maybe that's the real gift of absinthe, not the taste, not the ritual, not even the myth, but the pause. In a world of fast drinks and faster distractions, absinthe asks you to stop, to watch the louche bloom, to smell the herbs, to remember that drinking, once upon a time, was not just consumption, it was communion, with history, with art, with the strange, shimmering edge of the human imagination. That, more than any hallucination, is the real magic. And in that moment when the glass turns milky, the anise rises, and the world slows just a little, you're not just drinking. You're participating in something older than memory, and just rebellious enough to feel a little dangerous. Even if, deep down, you know it's all perfectly legal now. Chapter 9. The Science of Intoxication. Of all the stories absinthe dragged behind its long green train, None was more persistent than the claim that it could drive you mad. Not drunk, not tipsy, but truly, clinically, irrevocably insane. That it was not merely a spirit, but a slow-burning, poison-wearing perfume. That every sip was a descent, not into joy, but into the kind of delusion that left men howling at their walls and poets clawing at hallucinations of flame-eyed insects. And for a time, the world believed it. What's fascinating more than the claim itself is how science became a willing accomplice to the myth. We have to remember, the 19th century was a golden age for bad science. This was a time when doctors still bled patients to balance humours, when fainting was a diagnosable condition, and when female hysteria could be treated with a good rest and a stronger male presence. Neurology was still in its infancy, toxicology was a whisper, and the line between moral failure and medical symptom was blurred beyond recognition. So when a few French doctors, struggling to explain the rising rates of epilepsy, hallucinations, and erratic behaviour among the working class, stumbled upon a correlation, many of their patients drank absinthe. They did what all good panic-inclined societies do. They turned a pattern into a cause. They named it absinthism. A condition unique, they claimed, to those who consumed the Emerald Menace. Symptoms included not just the usual effects of heavy drinking, tremors, confusion, liver damage, but also peculiar neurological issues, seizures, hallucinations, convulsions. The mind unhooking from reality. They described it like a slow possession. The body remained, but the self unravelled. It didn't take long for these medical reports to trickle into newspapers, speeches, and courtrooms. Soon, any crime committed under the influence of absinthe wasn't just drunken violence, it was evidence of poisoning. When Jean Lanfray shot his wife and children in 1905, after a long day of drinking, absinthe included, though alongside brandy, wine, and creme de menthe, the press didn't call him a drunk. They called him a victim, not of his own rage or of alcoholism, but of absinthe-induced psychosis. The moralists seized it, the headlines screamed it. And suddenly, absinthe wasn't just a drink. It was a criminal defence. But here's the thing, very little of it held up to scrutiny. Even by the scientific standards of the day, the evidence was shaky. The absinthism case studies rarely controlled for dosage, rarely separated the drink from the drinker's other habits, and often lacked even basic record-keeping. Most of the patients were chronic alcoholics, consuming massive quantities of ethanol, regardless of the source. And yet, the blame fell squarely on wormwood. Specifically on thujone, a compound found in wormwood in small quantities. Thujone is a terpene, a fragrant chemical found in many plants, from sage to tarragon. In extremely high concentrations, it can have convulsant effects. Laboratory rats injected with pure thujone showed signs of seizure activity. But this was not what people were drinking. The amount of thujone in traditional absinthe was small, and the typical glass contained even less. You'd have to drink so much absinthe to reach toxic thujone levels that alcohol poisoning would kill you first. But again, nuance rarely makes headlines. So thujone became the villain, the molecule of madness, despite the fact that rosemary tea contains more thujone per serving than a glass of absinthe ever did. No one bans rosemary. No one clutches their pearls over a sage-sprinkled roast. But absinthe, that, they said, was the madness molecule in a bottle. In truth, what most people experienced while drinking absinthe was what they would have experienced drinking anything of that proof, especially if they were malnourished, dehydrated, or drinking on an empty stomach, as many of the working poor did. Hallucinations? Often just the result of delirium tremens, the withdrawal-fueled condition that occurs in severe alcoholics. Seizures? Not from thujone, but from repeated ethanol exposure. Memory loss? Liver damage? Emotional instability? All well-documented consequences of chronic alcoholism, not of absinthe specifically. Modern science, when it finally got around to revisiting the hysteria with clearer tools and cooler heads, found little to support the panic. Chemical analyses of pre-ban absinthes, preserved in dusty bottles and cracked cellars, showed thujone levels far below dangerous thresholds. Controlled tasting studies in the early 2000s debunked the idea that absinthe caused psychedelic effects. In blind tests, participants drinking authentic absinthe were no more likely to report hallucinations than those drinking similarly strong herbal spirits. And yet, the myth persists. Why? Because science may debunk a story, but it can't replace it. Saying absinthe won't make you hallucinate is technically comforting, but narratively disappointing. It's like discovering pirates never actually made people walk the plank, or that Vikings probably didn't wear horned helmets. The truth, while important, often lacks the sparkle of a good lie. And absinthe, sweet, bitter, emerald-hued absinthe, was too seductive a villain to give up easily. Even now you'll hear whispers. Bartenders playing into the theatre, telling wide-eyed tourists that absinthe hits different, that it's a special kind of drunk, that it opens the mind. Some even claim to see the green fairy after a few glasses. It's theatre. It's expectation. It's the placebo effect in a glass. And it's irresistible. But in the end, what the science tells us is that absinthe was never the monster it was made out to be. It was simply alcohol strong, yes, and herbal, complex, mysterious, but not malevolent. The madness was real, but it came not from wormwood, but from ignorance, fear, and the slow poison of moral panic disguised as medicine. What's left is a legacy of cautionary tales and cultural misunderstandings, of molecules misjudged, of drinks misrepresented, and of an era that confused artful intoxication with disease. But there's beauty in that too. Because in tracing the arc of absinthe from sacred tonic to outlawed elixir, we see not just a history of a drink, but the history of human fear. Fear of pleasure. Fear of the other. Fear of what we don't understand. And perhaps, in the right light, with the right amount of cold water clouding the glass, that fear becomes something else entirely. Something worth sipping slowly. If the early 20th century buried absinthe beneath fear and regulation, then the late 20th century began the quiet work of exhumation. And unlike its dramatic ban, its return wasn't marked by riots or courtroom theatrics, but by something far subtler: curiosity. A generation raised on whispered legends and faded posters began asking a simple question: what exactly had we banned? In the 1990s, a few curious scientists and liquor historians cracked open dusty cellars and retrieved sealed pre-ban absinthe bottles long forgotten in European estates. With precision tools and modern chromatography, they broke the myth molecule by molecule. What they found wasn't a bottle full of madness, but rather a spirit containing thujone levels far below the toxic hysteria once believed. Not enough to cause seizures, not enough to inspire fairies, just enough to add a gentle, medicinal bitterness beneath the wormwood and fennel. Suddenly, all the scaffolding of fear began to crumble, and in its place a new structure formed, one built not from panic, but nostalgia, mystery, and frankly, excellent marketing. Because let's be honest, part of absinthe's appeal in the modern world is its legend. People don't order it because they love the taste, which, to be fair, is an acquired one. They order it for the ceremony. The slotted spoon, the sugar cube, the ice-cold water drip that turns the emerald liquid milky white, like watching a magic trick unfold in your glass. It's an experience, a ritual, and for some, a rebellion. Because, isn't there something deliciously rebellious about drinking what used to be forbidden? By the early 2000s, country by country, the bans began to lift. Not because governments had suddenly developed a soft spot for absinthe, but because there was no scientific basis to maintain prohibition. France legalized it again under specific thujone limits. The United States, always a bit slower to let go of a good scare, followed in 2007 with its own version. Legal if the product contained less than 10 parts per million of thujone. Spoiler, most never contained more than that to begin with. And so, absinthe came back, not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper and a whiff of aniseed. Bartenders, always happy to have something theatrical to set on fire, reintroduced it to cocktails. Mixologists dusted off 19th century recipes. Some even designed modern drinks around it, combining it with citrus, bitters, and gin in careful proportions to soften its infamous bitterness. The Sazerac, once a staple in New Orleans and nearly lost to time, found new life with an absinthe rinse, absinthe fountains. Those beautiful spouted glass urns reappeared on upscale bar counters, lending the night a vintage glamour most liquors can only dream of. But make no mistake, what came back wasn't quite what had vanished. Modern absinthe, though legally allowed to call itself by the old name, is more refined, more controlled, and, let's be honest, more tamed. Many brands play into the myth with green fairies on the label and names like Lucid or La Fée. But the truth is, we've built a new story atop the ruins of the old one. One where absinthe isn't a mind-warping danger or a bohemian gasoline, but a well-packaged niche product with a tragic backstory and high Instagram appeal. What's curious, though, is how quickly culture forgot the absurdity of the panic. Very few people today remember the shaky science, the court cases built on hallucination, or the mountains of fake studies. And perhaps that's for the best. But what remains is the more subtle lesson. The reminder that, again and again, society has a tendency to scapegoat what it doesn't fully understand. That when things go wrong, when violence erupts, when health declines, when culture shifts in uncomfortable ways, it's often easier to point at a bottle than at the system, the poverty, or the politics. Absinthe was not the first drink to bear that weight, and it certainly won't be the last. Throughout history, governments have leaned on moral panics to distract from deeper issues. Blaming absinthe was a convenient narrative. It was foreign, herbal, strange, embraced by artists and outsiders. It didn't fit the mold of safe, patriotic drinks like wine and beer, and so it became the perfect villain in a time when control was more important than truth. Even today, remnants of that mindset linger. In how we treat new substances, how we sensationalize danger, and how we struggle to separate personal responsibility from cultural fear. Absinthe's story isn't just about a drink. It's about a society's uneasy relationship with pleasure, freedom, and the blurry boundary between control and creativity. So the next time someone leans across a bar eyes wide and asks, "Is it true that absinthe makes you hallucinate?" you can smile and tell them the truth. No, it doesn't. But it does make people believe interesting things. And sometimes that belief is more intoxicating than any chemical. What absinthe teaches us, through all the scandal, the bans, the misguided science, is that the stories we tell about substances are often more powerful than the substances themselves. And in that sense, maybe the green fairy never left. Maybe she just stopped haunting our minds and started whispering in our metaphors instead. Now, she waits in the background, quiet, elegant, misunderstood. Until the next generation feels bold enough to pour the glass, light the sugar, and rediscover her for themselves. Chapter 10: Myth, Memory, and the Taste of Escape. Absinthe may no longer hide behind bar curtains or whisper from the corners of scandalous pamphlets, but something about it still feels like a secret. Not the kind of secret that's shameful or forbidden, but the kind tucked away in a drawer, an heirloom of another era, meant to be taken out only when the mood is just right and the night demands something more than routine. In a world that thrives on the predictable, absinthe is, and always has been, an escape. Not just from sobriety, though that part is obvious, but from reality, from modernity's obsession with clarity, measurement, speed, and efficiency. Absinthe is inefficient by design. You don't knock it back, you don't chug it at parties, you prepare it, you wait. You watch the louche unfold like a watercolour, slowly overtaking the clear emerald with a ghostly milkiness. It's a drink that demands stillness in a time allergic to it. And in that way, it hasn't changed much from the Belle Époque, even if everything else has. Back then, it was the drink of those teetering between brilliance and collapse. Not because it was dangerous, but because it belonged to a culture that was. A culture dancing on the edge of war, decadence, and philosophical exhaustion. A culture that was questioning God, class, sex, science, all while painting cathedrals with light and sound in cabarets and salons. When you think about it, it's not so different from today. We live now in another moment of overwhelming noise, constant updates, infinite feeds. The ritual of pouring absinthe doesn't just slow the moment, it pushes against the very structure of our modern world. It's not rebellious in the fiery sense anymore, but it's quietly subversive, in its refusal to be efficient, in its need for preparation, in its dedication to presence. And that's part of why it persists, not as a mainstream drink, but as a cultural relic with a pulse, because every generation rediscovers absinthe through its own lens. For some, it's the drink of poets and outcasts. For others, it's a Gothic accessory or a museum piece or a bottle with just enough mystery to justify a Friday night experiment. For historians, it's a case study in moral panic and propaganda. For bartenders, a dramatic flourish to impress tourists. And for the rare, true connoisseur, it remains a deeply herbal, complex, and bittersweet spirit that rewards attention and punishes impatience. But for most, absinthe exists in a place just outside truth. It lives in the foggy space between legend and memory, where a drink becomes something larger than itself. You can't separate the liquid from the myth, and maybe that's the point. Maybe absinthe is more about what it represents than what it tastes like. It represents the allure of the forbidden, long after the danger has passed. It represents the dream of art over commerce, imagination over fact. And above all, it represents the idea that even in a structured, rational world, there are still corners reserved for ritual, myth, and a touch of madness. Because humans don't just want to drink, they want to believe. And absinthe, in all its chlorophyll-drenched glory, offers belief in a bottle. Not belief in fairies or visions necessarily, but in something quieter and more human, that there's beauty in slowness, richness in mystery, and a kind of sacredness in the way we consume. Absinthe turns drinking into ceremony. It whispers to the part of us that still wants stories, still craves meaning and motion, even when that motion is nothing more than water spiraling through a sugar cube into a waiting glass. So no, absinthe probably never made anyone hallucinate. It didn't steal minds or summon demons or corrupt a generation. But it did something subtler. It offered a portal, a green-stained window through which people could imagine a world more vivid, more daring, more alive. And if that's not a kind of magic, what is? It's fitting that the story of absinthe ends not with a definitive conclusion, but with a gentle fade into suggestion, much like the drink itself. As the 21st century continues its endless forward charge toward cleaner code, shorter attention spans, and more efficient everything, absinthe stands quietly in the corner, unconcerned. It is not here to compete. It has no app, no startup pitch, no promise of productivity. What it has is something much older and, in some ways, far more potent: atmosphere. For all the science that has dissected absinthe, measured its thujone levels, proven and disproven its psychotropic reputation, the truth is that no one drinks it for the data. People drink it because it feels like opening a door into another time, because it carries within it the vapour of gaslit Parisian evenings, the smell of old books, the hum of violins beneath cigarette smoke, and the muttered philosophies of a man who hasn't paid rent in 6 months, but still believes he'll change the world by morning. It's a flavour soaked in nostalgia, sometimes accurate, often imagined, always seductive. We're strange creatures, us humans. We claim to love reason, progress, evidence. And yet again and again, we wrap our identities around symbols, around myths, around the idea that a particular hat or scent or drink can tether us to something greater, something lost or forbidden or glamorous in its ruin. Absinthe has survived not because of what it is, but because of what it evokes. And that may be its greatest achievement. There's an irony here, of course. The very drink once feared for its madness, blamed for murders and moral decay, has become a symbol of refinement. You'll now find absinthe in upscale cocktail menus, served by tattooed bartenders in suspenders. Its preparation narrated like an incantation. Absinthe isn't dangerous anymore. It's curated, safe, legal, marketable, yet it still carries the residue of its old self, like a retired outlaw who now gives TED Talks but keeps the revolver unloaded, of course, on his shelf. But every so often, someone takes it seriously. Someone pours a glass not to impress a date or snap a photo, but because they want to feel close to something that resists simplification. They want to sit still, to dissolve sugar into bitterness, to wait and watch the green turn to cloudy white, to listen to the silence between sips. And in that moment, absinthe does what it was always meant to do. It doesn't make you hallucinate. It doesn't whisper madness. What it does is gently invite you to forget how tightly the world has been wound. It lets you loosen just a little, to remember that you are not just a unit of productivity or a dot on a digital map. You are a person with senses and stories, capable of ritual and reverie. In that way, absinthe offers not intoxication, but orientation, not escape, but return, to yourself, to the past, to a time when people believed that art could be a revolution, that conversation could be salvation, that mystery was not a flaw in the system, but its most essential feature. Of course, all this may be a bit much for a drink. It is, at the end of the day, just a mixture of herbs, alcohol, and myth. But if you've stayed with us through this story, through the monks and the medics, the artists and anarchists, the trials and exiles, the chemists and the capitalists, then perhaps you too have begun to see how the past clings to flavour, how meaning ferments over time, and how even a glass can become a vessel of history. Absinthe is no longer illegal in most of the world. It is not the monster we once believed, nor is it the magic it was once promised to be. What it is now, what it has always been, is a mirror. One that reflects not our worst impulses, but our deepest yearnings, for beauty, for danger, for transformation, for a world just slightly stranger than the one we live in. So, if you ever find yourself in a quiet bar, with nowhere to be and a mind in need of a different kind of journey, ask for the green fairy. Let her whisper to you, not of hallucinations or ghosts, but of memory, of the way stories bend truth, of how fear makes legends, and how sometimes the things we most try to banish are the ones that outlast us all. And when you lift your glass, don't toast to madness or myth. Toast to the persistence of the beautifully unnecessary, to the rituals we forgot we needed, to the stories that never truly ended, and most of all, to the quiet rebellion of pouring something old into a glass, watching it change, and believing, if only for a moment, that transformation is still possible. Sleep well, history lovers. The green fairy watches over you now. You've just wandered through over a century of myth, medicine, madness, and marketing. From dusty apothecaries to Parisian cafés, from courtroom scandals to modern cocktail menus, absinthe has survived every attempt to bury it. Sometimes with flame, often with slander, but never with silence. And now, as your glass sits empty, or perhaps still untouched, we invite you to sit back, breathe, and remember this. History isn't just wars and kings and dates on marble. It's what people whispered over drinks, what they believed while half lit in the corner of some forgotten room. It's flavour, ritual, fear, beauty, and sometimes, yes, a green-hued hallucination that was never real but always needed. Thanks for sailing into the past with us. Here at the Drowsy Historian, We don't just tuck you in with facts. We unravel the forgotten lives, intoxicating habits, and strange rituals that time tried to hide beneath the sheets. So if this story stirred something in you, some forgotten thirst for mystery or meaning, subscribe, share it with your fellow insomniacs, and join us again soon for another sip of the strange, another toast to the past. Until next time, sleep well, dream deeper, and let the echoes of history keep whispering long after the lights go out.